Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. My guest for this episode was Dr. Ashley Morgan. Dr. Ashley is a sociologist in the Cardiff School of Art and Design at Cardiff Metropolitan University, so a little bit different to our normal guests in terms of the kind of faculty she works in. And Dr. Ashley specialises in looking at areas to do with masculinity, the body, feminism, and in particular, identity. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Hi, yes, my name is Dr. Ashley Morgan and I am a senior academic at the Cardiff School of Art and Design, which is part of Cardiff Metropolitan University. I teach modules on the body and also things to do with materialism and objects. I pride myself on being the only sociologist in the School of Art and Design. My colleagues are social theorists and artists and designers, but one of the things I think is really important is if you're designing or if you're an artist, much of what you're doing is influenced by the things around you, which as I understand it is sociology. So I'm very keen to remind students that thinking about things in a sociological manner is really important because they see themselves as being designers. And I say, well, what are you designing? Oh, I'm designing objects. I'm designing things to help facilitate people. And I say, okay, so have you looked at groups of people in order to help your designs? And they often go, oh no, we didn't think of that, because they're quite stuck in a sense, in a very particular methodology. And when I introduce them to things like social constructionism or just thinking about how objects and people exist in the world, and particularly things like embodiment and the different ways that people think, that normally turns on quite a few light bulbs for them.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in sort of having this sense of, I call myself a sociologist in the School of Art and Design, and I really stick with that because I think it's really important that they understand, students understand, and also my colleagues, that what we're talking about all the time is people and groups of people. And it's really important to remind people of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it, that we kind of think of them as being very, very different disciplines, actually, art and sociology, but the correlation is there.
It very much is. And one of the things I always I speak to students about is, particularly in my body module, they say things like, well, society thinks this and society thinks that. And I say, but who is society? Because your society, you're part of society. So what does that mean to you? And how can we extrapolate those meanings in relation to what you do, whether you're making something decorative or physical, whether your work is about guiding people or helping people? How do you think about that in terms of where do you fit in terms of society? And they again, that sort of really reminds them. Sometimes I think with particularly undergraduate students, they feel a bit isolated in what they're doing. They know they're a part of a student body, and again, one of the things I talk to them very much about is sense of identity and the way in which identity is constructed as both something that is similar and very different. And again, this sort of reminds them that they're not just an amorphous cohort of undergraduate students. They've all got something individual to offer as well. And young people love talking about identity. It's really important to them, particularly I think in social media times where, and the thing I find very interesting about that is that they've got very fixed ideas about the way social media influences identity. But actually, I get them to think about things like the way in which people mediate themselves, and the way in which, I get them to take selfies, for example. I say, go on, take a selfie of yourself. And they do it about 5 times. I say, well, so what you're looking at here, you've sort of edited yourself. We're all editing ourselves all the time. And then we get into sort of talking about things like Goffman and theorists. And one of the other things I introduced them to very early on, because I think all students should understand Foucault. And I think Foucault is one of these people who, I think he's got something to say for everybody. There's something there in Foucault. It's really inspiring, but B, it reminds students that they are visible all the time. We talk about how visibility is a trap, and I always introduce them the concept of the panopticon, which they always find really interesting. They go, oh my God, the panopticon. And I said, I know, it's a 19th century idea, but look how relevant it is to today. And they go, oh yeah, we love the panopticon. So I think it's really important. I think things like this are really important to discuss, particularly in contemporary times. And one of the questions that you wanted to ask me was, who are your favourite theorists?
Yeah.
So I've got to say Foucault. My background is this. I went to art college when I left school, and I didn't get onto a degree course, and it took me ages to get on to a degree course, and I ended up doing health studies and social politics, which just completely inspired me. And then I ended up doing my PhD in sociological studies. And it was from then on, really, that I felt really... there was a lot of reading of Foucault, there was a lot of Merleau-Ponty, there was a lot of some of these really interesting how to live in the world kind of people. And it always struck me when I was a postgraduate, that it was really important, particularly for young people, to understand these concepts. So Foucault was has always been really important to me. And I think I've actually read Madness and Civilization all the way through, and Discipline and Punish all the way through, because I'm such a horrendous geek and I want to find out what he says about some really interesting things like structures of society, the way in which people live, the way in which we understand hierarchy, for example. So I really, really loved Foucault, and I really try my best to help students understand that they can access quite heavy theory quite easily. And I think Foucault and the concept of the panopticon is it's a really good start for them. One of the things that I found the most useful is reading Ruane Connell's work, Men and Masculinities, because one of the things that did was really switch me on to the idea of men not being part of the patriarchal dividend. It doesn't, this idea of men being in charge doesn't work for all men. And I just remember being so intrigued by that, and it had a really meaningful effect on me when I was thinking about myself and my position as a woman. I come from a very sort of working class background. One of the things I've noticed about working class backgrounds is that there's a sense of inverted snobbery and anti-intellectualism. I'm working on this at the moment. I'm writing an abstract for a conference about steel towns. I'm from a place called Port Talbot in South Wales, which people only really understand through the steelworks. And I'm writing a sort of feminist autoethnography of life in the steelworks, town, because it's always, anything you read about steel towns, it's all about masculinity and the way in which post-industrialization has had a massive impact on masculinity and affect and identity. What is always missing from these kind of things is a feminist discourse, which I'm hoping to contribute to. But back to Connell and masculinity. As a woman growing up in a place like Port Talbot, I felt really oppressed by masculinity. And when I read Connell and read about the way in which working class men, black men, gay men, might all be oppressed by patriarchy, it really resonated with me. And I understood the concept then of male marginalisation and male subordination. And that really has had the most profound effect on me in my research, because that's when I started exploring masculinity and thinking about, again, this sort of sociological aspect about men. And I do this on a sort of meta level, but also on this very sort of whimsical, we could say sort of, it's interesting. I really like Daniel Miller's work when he talks about stuff, and he talks about the way in which we understand our identities as layers. He talks about the way in which we're sort of like an onion. There's layers and layers of who we are. And he says, what if really, when we peel those layers away, really who we are is what we're interested in, the things that we like, the clothes that we wear. Why is that a problem? Why is that considered as not very interesting or not very academic? And it was from that I started thinking about men and clothing.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I'm really interested in, again, as a sociologist, I look around a lot, and I started looking at, it really struck me about 10, 12 years ago, that clothes for men can be quite problematic. There's such, my latest work, and I've got, hopefully I'll have a PhD student starting in September, where we're going to explore the lack of diversity in men's clothing. Why is men's clothing so dire? Why is it so boring? Why can't men experiment with colour and different kinds of clothing? Why is men dressing up so problematic? And by this, I'm not talking about men dressing up in terms of looking like men. And I've written about men and the importance of suits and the simplicity of the suit. And one of the things that I've argued is that there's no single item of clothing that works for women in the way that the suit works for men, in the way we understand masculinity, patriarchy, hegemonic masculinity, and the way this is represented through men in suits. There is nothing that's the same for women. There's nothing that really edifies women and puts them up there with, I can understand you being a strong, powerful woman because of what you're wearing. Because many of the options of clothing for women is just all about sexualizing the body. Yes. So I was thinking, look at the clothes men wear. And I was looking at my colleagues in work, bless them, and they're all, the older guys are all wearing sort of fleeces and jeans, and the younger guys are all in skinny jeans and t-shirts, and there was just, nobody was really, it just seemed so boring for them. So I started looking around and looking at reading into men's clothing, and I just found it so interesting because there's such a lack of research in men's clothing, apart from the wonderful and incredibly inspiring Ben Barry, who's a researcher he's in the Ryerson School of Fashion in Toronto, and he's an absolute trailblazer in terms of thinking about men and clothing, men's body size, men's body image, and the kind of clothes men wear and what that does for them. But also in my research, one of the things I've been thinking about is, so for example, I wrote an article on why men don't wear skirts. And again, this is something that came up in my my body module that I teach at level 4 students in work, which is, why don't men wear skirts? And it makes us realize part of the problem is the issue of the way in which society is structured and where power comes from. This is where we get into Foucault as well with students. But there is no reason other than social structures that men don't wear skirts. Men from other cultures are very much out there with skirts, and we talk about things like jalabayas, we talk about salwar kameez, and we talk about kilts particularly. We talk about men who dress up in drag, but I'm never particularly that interested in drag. There's a lot of fantastic writing about drag, which is great, but the thing I'm thinking about is, what is it that stops men from wearing a diversity of clothing? We understand women who wear trousers. I believe in France, at one point, it was illegal for women to wear trousers. I learned this recently, right. And I was completely astonished. And much of the sort of women in trousers was brought about either through the First and Second World Wars, in terms of practicality. And then after the First World War, of course, Coco Chanel made them a fashion item. But they were only really worn by upper middle class women. But really, there's been no every year when there's sort of men's fashion shows, there's always somebody pushing the boundaries by showing men in skirts. I mean, there's lots of people like Marc Jacobs and John Galliano and people like that have, and then more recently, people like Ralph Simons and Hedi Slimane have all sort of perhaps showcased a skirt type thing for men. But this really hasn't been taken up by men, and I part of me I really want to find out why not. And the reason is because if men suddenly start wearing clothing that is associated with women, it means that they will be feminized, which means fundamentally that they will suffer from marginalization and subordination, going right back to Connell. And this idea of, and I think feminization for men is the last great taboo in terms of masculinity. What can break masculinity and power? Feminization, I think. And I think that's what contributes to the lack of diversity in men's clothing. And I've just written a paper which is coming out this year in a journal, a fantastic journal for you listeners if they don't know it already. Lovely, particularly for A-level foundation students because of its accessibility. There's a fantastic journal called Critical Studies in Men's Fashion. And Ben Barry, whom I absolutely adore, is one of the editors in that. And the thing about Ben's work is it's really accessible. It's written in such a lovely, straightforward way. So it's really fabulous. He's got some really fabulous text. But my paper is about looking at the, I'm only laughing because I'm so old and it's not particularly in my purview to know or enjoy this, but I've written a paper about Matty Healy, the lead singer of the band in 1975.
Yeah.
And what I've done there is talk about his trajectory from a sort of skinny emo kid to quite a lauded rock star. And what I think his position has allowed him to do is to wear different kinds of clothing. But what he does is, like lots of rock stars of the past have done, is wear women's clothing in a very unironic way. He's not trying to be a woman. He's just wearing women's clothing as a part of diversity, I think. And this strikes me as being interesting in a number of ways. One of the ways it strikes me as being interesting is how mundane it can be to challenge masculine norms by wearing a skirt. It's such an ordinary thing to do. Kurt Cobain did it. Evan Dando from the Lemonheads did it. There's a big, he's doing nothing new in that. But he is also a public figure, particularly for young people. And for them, it appears to be new. But also, it suggests how fragile the concept of masculinity is in terms of the boundaries that can be pushed in, and this idea of feminizing masculinity.
Yeah.
It's so fragile. It's so I don't know. I just find it really interesting. But I also think he's doing something quite new in relation to emo masculinity. Emo of the past was very much black. It was all black and skinny and depressing, and sort of. But I think he's doing something very interesting in terms of hybrid masculinity now. He's really pushing boundaries of emo in its sort of fairly narrow form and making it into something new, I think. So I think that's interesting in terms of his relevance as a sort of young person's icon. But I'm also interested in the skirt wearing because it just strikes, this idea of you can, how do you push boundaries of masculinity? You wear a flowery skirt with little socks, with your shirt, with your t-shirt. It's really interesting to me as well, because when I teach this, a student always, it seems to give a student permission in my university to suddenly wear a skirt and express themselves a bit more. Because one of the things I find really interesting working in the School of Art and Design is how conformist young people are. The girls have got long hair, the boys' hair is short, everybody wears trousers and jeans, or the girls wear skirts. Nobody really mixes this up. And I always point out to them how ironic that is in a very sort of, in a global world why are you dressing the same as everybody else? And then we go back to ideas about identity and power.
Yeah.
Really.
One of the things that I was just interested in that you just talked about is, for example, if a female were to wear something that was traditionally quite masculine, let's say jeans, a hoodie, and boots.
Yeah.
Fairly normal, okay? If a man dresses feminine, it's called cross-dressing. But we don't tend to say cross-dressing the other way. So why do you think that happens?
One of the things I think in fashion and clothing, there's been a real uptake in the concept of gender neutrality in terms of clothing. And I think there is no such thing as gender neutrality. I understand it, the concept intellectually, but I never see it. And if you look at sort of fashion and clothing, when you see things that are either, we'll put the cross-dressing idea to one side for a start, but in terms of gender neutrality and androgynous clothing, which I've also seen in sort of fashion, what that means is women dressing in big square clothing, always trousers, always oversized, so you can't tell that there's a woman's body underneath, and there's no equivalent to that in terms of masculinity. So, I mean, there may be something in terms of like a male sarong, but it's not widely. It's very high-end fashion, and it's not widely used. The concept of cross-dressing sort of goes back to times when young men were acting, when only men were allowed to act in sort of Shakespearean times, and cross-dressing and the way in which people were fooled. There's a lot of that in Shakespeare, that there are quite a lot of Shakespeare plays where there are women dressed as men. Sometimes there are women dressed as men who perform as women again, and everybody's completely shocked. Everybody's completely taken in by the way in which the cross-dressing sort of manifests itself. They understand the person. I thought you were, I'm in love with you, and I thought you were a woman, but you turned out to be a man. But I knew that all along, kind of thing. So I think cross-dressing is quite. I think it's quite an old term now.
Yeah.
And although obvious sexual behaviours are absent, how do we read protagonists as male? Because we understand men and sex being so, the conflation between men and sex being so great, and it having such a symbiosis. But in sociology and studies of sex and behaviour, there is research to suggest that if they're called cross-sex relationships, when men and women have extremely close relationships, but they're non-sexual, and it's called cross-sex, and it's an interesting one. There's quite a bit of research on it, and I have, again, I'm just about to finish an article where I've introduced a word, instead of calling it cross-sex, a relationship between men and women that's non-sexual, cross-sex, I've coined the term plomance, which is a portmanteau word of platonic love and romance, sort of in the style of bromance.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of the word cross-sex in terms of non-sexual relationships seems very clinical and sterile, and I think there's room for another word as well. But just going back to the point about cross-sex and clothing, I don't think it's so widely used a term as gender-neutral clothing and androgyny in sort of fashion terms, really. I'm not sure it's as used.
Yeah. What about something like, RuPaul's Drag Race? Is that pushing the boundaries and perhaps opening up doors a little bit more?
I don't know. I think one of the things I think about Britain especially is that we've got such a tradition of drag that I find it quite interesting that we have it as an American import.
Yeah.
Because drag started in Britain, as far as I know. I mean, again, I'm not a historian by any means. So there might have been. I know in India, drag historically was very was a thing in a very long time ago, hundreds of years ago. But I find it really interesting that it's considered such an American thing, whereas I think in Britain we've got such a profound understanding of drag. It's how we understand a lot of masculine acting to be, really. So I find the whole American concept of it really interesting. Like it's been sort of taken over.
Yeah.
But I think British audiences completely understand drag. It was very common growing up to see men dressed as women, and us all understanding, even from a very young age, these were men dressed as women for entertainment.
Yeah.
So I think it's very much in the British psyche that we know this. That's a form of entertainment. We understand it. So I find it really interesting that it's an American import.
Yeah. I also thought someone like Grayson Perry, and that's quite interesting. Recently he's on lockdown, he's been doing some shows, and he's not been dressing feminized. He's been saying that he hasn't dressed up for 2 months. He's just sort of fallen back into t-shirt and trousers and back towards masculine dress again. So I wonder if it's just used as kind of a performance rather than a day in, day out thing. Yes,
and if you're not going out, who are you performing to?
Yeah.
Although, for today to talk to you, I'm not in my pajamas because it makes me feel more professional to be dressed and everything. But I just think if your audience is much more limited, who are you performing to? But on the other hand, under lockdown, it might mean that some people are finding the space to experiment with clothing in ways that perhaps they haven't felt the confidence to do before.
Yeah.
So I wonder really after lockdown whether we're going to emerge in a much more interesting way. I'd like to think so. I'd like to think people would feel more confident about experimenting with clothing because, it goes back to this lack of diversity in men's clothing. I gave a talk last term to some psychology students, and I sort of said about, who thinks that men's clothing is just really dire? And about, 70% of the class put their hands up and they all rolled their eyes, women and men. The men were like, oh, and the girls were like, oh, we'd just like to see men wearing something different. And the boys were like, well, it's just here I am in my tracksuit, or here I am in my, very boring colours, just awful. Because, the concept of gendered colours, again, is something that's very ingrained in the British psyche. But yes, it still bothers me that the lack of diversity in men's clothing still really bothers me, because it suggests that some men who perhaps might really benefit from expressing themselves through clothing don't have that opportunity. And that's why, your point about Grayson Perry is really interesting. And, again, going back to maybe the positive angle, is that maybe lots of people are experimenting with their clothing now and maybe feeling a bit better about themselves and not so, I always have to wear a grey T-shirt. Yeah. That was my man voice, by the way.
That's good. Thank you. Actually, it's going to be the end of part one. In part two, I'd like to talk to you more about, because I agree with the idea of boring men's clothing. Okay, welcome back to part two. I'm talking to Dr. Ashley Morgan. Firstly, Ashley, I really, really agree with you about men's clothing. I first noticed this, actually. Do you remember the old catalogues like Kay's and Grattan catalogues and so on?
Yes.
And I remember pointing out to my mum that about 80% of it was for females and there was only this short section for men. I've also discussed with my girlfriend as well, actually, when I was going to a wedding in the summer, that I'm quite envious of female choices. The dresses, the colours, how expressive you can be. And men, it's black, blue suit. Maybe you could be experimental with the tie, but that's about as far as it goes. Where's that come from? Where has this boring men's clothing come from? Because I definitely agree with it.
Boring men's clothes come from the fact that that men don't have to... it doesn't matter whether men express themselves through clothing, I don't think, in terms of masculine power. I think the minute, I find this really interesting. So a couple of years ago, I've written about the way in which men's suits are a really interesting item of clothing. If you look at Tim Edwards calls it, and Anne Hollander both call it, and they say, right, suits are really masculine clothing. Anne Hollander said that suits were very much symbolic of sex, and the sex they were symbolic of was the male sex. She wrote a fantastic book called Sex and Suits, and again, a really lovely text. And Tim Edwards, the sociologist as well, talks about the way in which men's suits are symbolic of masculinity. And I think, is it Edwards? Somebody quotes, they sort of changed Le Corbusier had a quotation which was, "The house is a machine for living." And I think it's Hollander or somebody like that said, "The suit for men is a machine for living in." You put a suit on and everybody understands that you are arguably a hegemonic man.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I think is quite interesting is that, and Edward says this and Hollander, that a suit is as suitable for a young man to wear on his first job interview, or to go to court if he's been convicted of a crime, as it is for the President of America. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is when Hillary Clinton was running for president, the way in which she wore what in America is referred to as pantsuits, because it's very hard for a woman to wear clothing and exude the same kind of power that a man does. And it's the same with Angela Merkel as well. Angela Merkel wore sort of long jackets, sort of quite buttoned up to the collar, which made her look a bit better sometimes, I think, than open collars on women are problematic. One of the things with men's suits is the way in which the tie finishes it off. Okay, so the tie and a collar are really important because the buck stops there. I always think the tie points to the apex of power, which is what men say. Okay, so the tie is sort of pointing up to the suit, to the mouth, and what comes out of men's mouths is more important than how they look. Okay, so I think the suit is very important, but this idea of young men dressing up in suits make them, if you look at sort of little boys dressing up for confirmation, for example, they wear suits and it makes them look like men in waiting. They know that they're going to take on the mantle of masculinity in the future, and with that, possible privilege that comes with masculinity. So I think there are some really interesting British designers, though, I would say, Matthew. We've got some, if you think about Oswald Boateng from the late 80s, early 90s, and the way he experimented with men's clothing and suits. One of the things Boateng was really famous for was the lining of men's suits being really brightly coloured. Yeah. And then he also experimented with tailored shorts and jackets. And I understand the tailored shorts and jackets thing is quite common in Australia, who have a very relaxed dress code apparently, but it's much more common to see men in shorts as formal attire.
Yeah.
There's a really I'd love to interview this guy actually. There's a really interesting Welsh designer called Nathan Palmer. And Nathan Palmer, again, does something really interesting in terms of colour and suiting. And he does things like different colour, although he makes suits for men that are matching, they might be in different fabrics, different textures and different colours sometimes. And his stuff is absolutely to die for, I have to say. So there are some designers, but for your bod in the street, if I think about the clothes my husband wears, it's sort of fleeces. It's sort of, there was a whole tranche of men at one point wearing sort of outdoor gear.
Yeah.
Particularly in academia, a sort of middle-aged chap would rock up in sort of crag hopper trousers and a fleece, and that was clothing. I look at some of the men in work, and no academic men wear suits, which I find really interesting because they don't need to. And I think that as well about the clothes I wear. It doesn't matter what I look like. It matters much more what I say, which is, I'm really grateful to be working in academia because I could not dress up in the way some women are supposed to dress as in terms of smart clothing. But going back to your point about one of the things that, again, is problematic for men is ways in which they engage with glamour. Glamour, again, is this sort of feminized version of something which is worrying, and for men, I think it's back to sort of Judith Butler, troubling gender. This idea, how do you make a man look glamorous? It's really difficult, I think. And again, going back to somebody like Matty Healy, the way in which he glamorizes himself is the way in which women do, is often through hair and jewellery. But also, I'm thinking about things like, you say, going to a wedding. When you look at things like the Oscar ceremony and the Met Gala and all things like that, the women are uniformly in long dresses, whether it suits them or not.
Yeah.
And the men could, as you said, they could be dressed in anything. It's a black suit, it's a blue suit, it's a white suit. I'm thinking about Marc Jacobs. There's a really lovely paper, again, in Critical Studies in Men's Fashion by a academic called Alex Carreño. And Carreño says, wrote a paper about Marc Jacobs. Marc Jacobs turned up to the Met Gala ball some years ago now, wearing white underwear with a black lace long shirt over it. And when he was asked why he was wearing that, he said, I didn't want to be boring and wear a tuxedo. And that, again, that really struck me as, poor men, that there's nothing, where's the glamour, where's the glitz? It's very easy, I think, in the sort of public eye and media particularly, for gay men to dress flamboyantly and for people to find that acceptable. So when you see I can't remember his first name, the chap Porter, the American guy, he turned up at the one of these balls. I mean, no disrespect, Matthew, but you and I are never going to go to balls or galas.
That's fair point.
And do you know what? For which I'm extremely grateful, I have to say. But there was Porter wearing, he wore a tuxedo on the top and an enormous ball gown skirt. And he is, professor of flamboyance. He's an openly gay man. It seems much more acceptable for him to dress like that. Ditto Marc Jacobs. Yeah. But, is anybody else going to dress like that? Probably not.
No, I mean, it's just made me think, actually, as a male, we're quite often told that kind of classic is a really good way to look. So a classic black suit, or I'm thinking someone like Ryan Gosling, he often dresses in just a plain crisp white t-shirt or a plain black t-shirt. So I would say, or George Clooney or someone like that. So even those sort of figures, we're taught that kind of classic is the way to go, but it's quite boring, isn't it?
But also, what does that, again, in this paper I've got coming out this year, one of the points I make is that there's a lack of gendered language around men's clothing. That's interesting. It's, as you say, it's smart, it's classic. Like, what does that even mean? That means that, I think those are sort of metaphors for boring.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. And
wear a suit and shut up and wear a suit, because it doesn't matter what you wear. You don't have to express your personality in your clothing because you're a man. Because it's more important what you say rather than how you look. And I just think that's just so negative. It's so limiting. But there's a complete lack of discourse around men's clothing that can describe it as sexy, as interesting, as nice, as glamorous. Again, the word glamorous is so feminized and loaded with feminine context that it's really inappropriate to think about it being associated with masculinity. Again, Ben Barry he sort of hints about this. There's an American writer called Mallory Malone, I think it's Mallory Malone, who has invented the theory of fabulousness, the way in which very marginalized men with disabilities, for example, can recapture a sense of flamboyance through clothing. And it's this term fabulousness, but it's all about people who are really at the margins of what we might term society, rather than your young man walking down the road getting a coffee. The most glamorous thing that I've noticed men doing in the past couple of years is growing a beard.
I was going to say, I think the language that would be used as well, that a male would either be talked about as critically as gay, for example, if he was feminized.
Flamboyance.
flamboyant or eccentric.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I sort of talk about, there's nothing new in men looking different. But what Barry talks about, and what I'm sort of very much interested in, is the risks involved in men pushing the boundaries of clothing. And that's why I think the risks inherent in that are really great. Barry talks about the way he's been beaten up for wearing nail varnish, for example. And I find this really interesting because my little male friends of my girl children, some of them are nail varnish wearing chaps. They like a bit of glitter. They like a bit of a what you call it, sequin, a little sequin on a t-shirt. It's a bit nice. They like all that. But boys' clothing doesn't really come with glitter very much. If it does, it's got a shark on it. It's a big shark glitter mouth. Or it's a dumper truck, or it's like some ridiculous notion of masculinity that's just really weird. If you look at it, it's extremely weird. But we know boys like that. But already in school, one of our little friends was really criticised for wearing silver sandals. That's what he liked. They were great. They were really nice sandals, but he had a lot of stick. And the problem is that lots of people worry about the merging of genders, about the way in which we might not be able to tell whether somebody is a boy or a girl. And I find that extraordinary. Again, I understand it intellectually, but it makes no sense to me at all. At all.
Because one of the phrases I've heard quite a bit, and this is me being guilty of watching some absolute rubbish on TV like Love Island and First Dates and so on as well, that quite often you hear females say, "Oh, I like a man who takes care of himself, but he shouldn't take longer in the bathroom than I do."
Yes,
and I think there seems to be this thing for a lot of males, take care in your appearance, but not too much.
Well, then you sort of, then you're in the realms of narcissism then, aren't you? It might be, oh gosh, he likes himself more than he likes me. Again, I don't really, as you said, it's either if you've got to take too much care in your appearance, you're gay, you're eccentric, or you're a narcissist, or you're all those things, and therefore you're not a regular bloke. There's this sense of regularity around men. Again, which is, like, what do they call it in America? Cookie cutter.
Metrosexuality as well. But I've thought of that as well. So, for example, you might on public transport see a female looking a little pocket mirror, checking her makeup or something like that.
Right.
There's times where I'd like to check my face, okay? But I think if I got a mirror out, I would be deemed as a narcissist as a male to check my own appearance.
And what is the problem with that, do you think?
I don't know. I don't think a female checking a pocket mirror would be called a narcissist, but a male would.
Yes, but why is being a narcissist? Why is being interested in your appearance is gendered, but everybody is interested in their appearance?
Yeah, I think more that it would be deemed, I think, and maybe I'm internalising this wrong, but I'm loving myself for looking at it. Rather than checking if I got a spot or if I got a hair out of place, I think I'd be feeling that I'd be judged for loving myself or being self-indulgent.
And again, going back to this idea, I mean, we're going right back to the beginning of the talk, really, this idea that there are sort of fixed norms for men and women, but also one of the problems with masculinity in its extant form is the way in which men are discouraged to look after themselves, because looking after yourself in any manner, whether it's checking yourself in the mirror just to make sure you look okay, your mental health or your appearance is perceived as undermining of masculinity. And again, I don't really understand where that comes from, or why that sort of self-care could be deemed as undermining of masculinity, when, as we understand it, men create all products anyway. So why? And again, then you go right back to sort of Foucault and thinking about the structures in society which we're bound by, which we are, the rules that we somehow are made to follow. Whereas, you know, the sky won't fall in if you pop a skirt on, will it? Really? Or if you flick your mirror out and just say, yeah, I'm all right. I haven't got a big smudge on my nose, or, you know.
Yeah, I was just thinking of someone like, say, Cristiano Ronaldo, who, you know, he likes his hair, he likes a fake tan, he's had his teeth done, he's done various things like that. And he likes his Instagram pictures of himself, but he is persistently referred to as a poser or loving himself. Even his sexuality has been questioned for that as well. So
yes, it's extraordinary. You know, don't love yourselves, but, you know, love yourself, but not too much.
Yeah.
It's this incredible sort of, it's a non-physical barrier. Well, again, it's back to sociology, isn't it? It's a structure. It's the way in which the structure of appearance is built up, which is just really, I find it really hard to, personally, I find it really hard to deal with. Yeah. I want, you know, it just seems weird to me that people, not weird, again, I understand intellectually, but I don't want to think that I live in a society where looking the way you want to look is problematic, but I know I do. And, you know, hey, I make a living out of it, I guess, by teaching it and writing about it. And yeah, I really struggle with it. I do try, and particularly with young people and students, I do say, you know, it's okay for you to be yourself, you know. It's okay. It's okay. Don't overthink it. But yeah.
I'm gonna try it. That's gonna be my next experiment. My next day out with the lads, whenever we can do that. I'm gonna get a pocket mirror out, check my appearance, see what happens. I might get a GoPro, check the recording, see what happens, see what the reaction is. Ashley, where can we read more of your work? I know you're on Twitter. Have you got a blog and so on as well?
No, I haven't got a blog. I'm on Twitter. I've got paper and clothing cultures. I write for The Conversation, television and popular culture, clothing cultures. I just mentioned my paper's coming out in critical studies in men's fashion towards the end of this year. I've got a book chapter coming out for the Routledge Handbook of Gender. I am doing a virtual conference. Hopefully I'll have my feminist autoethnography accepted for the Journal of a conference on steel towns. I am just pitching a book on Welsh masculinity for Routledge. So I will tweet when these things come out. I've got loads of stuff in the pipeline. Basically, there's all going to sort of, hopefully, I've got some stuff out, but the stuff on masculinity is building up, and it's going to come out in the next 18 months, really. There'll be a load of me. I'm also on, I gave a talk at New York University in April, and I will share the link with that on Twitter.
Great. Thank you very much for chatting to the podcast today, Ashley. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.